It was the end of November 1992. We had arrived in Abidjan in the Ivory Coast, and after 2 days of hard work we managed to get our Land Rovers out of the shipping containers and out of the port. We loaded up and we started driving east. Our plan was to spend Christmas in the Cameroon with friends there, and so we had a long journey still ahead of us. We drove through the Ivory Coast and then drove through Ghana and through Togo, and we entered Benin. We decided to stop for a couple of nights when we came across a beautiful stretch of beach at an area called Grand Popo. This was an area where historically it was one of the centres of the slave trade, and many Afro-Brazilians had settled here on coming back to Africa, and there was a lot of colonial architecture. It was a beautiful stretch. We found a safe place to camp, and we went out for a run that night on the sand. A lovely long run. We passed lots of fishermen on the beach preparing their boats to go out to fish. There were small fishermen villages, a lot of colour and vibrancy and life. It was a beautiful area. On our way back to camp, one of the team got talking to one of these fishermen, and he discovered that they were going out that night to fish. So over supper that night, as we talked around the fire, we thought, why don't a few of us see if we can go out with them on the boat? So we went back and we discovered that in the middle of the night they would be setting out, and later that night 4 of us left the other 4 asleep at camp, and we went down the beach to find the boat. We sat beside the boat, and in the middle of the night Christophe and some friends came and joined us. It was almost a full moon. It was the middle of the night. I wasn't wearing a watch, but it must have been midnight or 1 in the morning. Christophe was a young man, athletic, strong, clearly a good leader, and he was very good at explaining things to us. He said that the wind was still too strong and they would wait to see if the wind dropped. And if the wind dropped enough, we would go out. So we sat there on the beach for about an hour. 2 of the 4 of us decided at that point they would go home. Back to the campsite, they went back to bed, and myself and another guy stayed. After about an hour of waiting, the wind had died down, so Christophe said we were ready to go. He explained that the most dangerous, difficult part of the trip was actually getting out to sea. So we were very psyched up from his warnings. It took us about 20 minutes to drag the boat to the sea. It was a large pirogue, a dugout canoe, about 8 metres long, dug out from one huge tree trunk. It was probably 3-4 foot, so a metre wide, very, very heavy. So there were 8 guys. We were pulling this boat out towards the shore. It had planks running across it as benches. We had 8 paddles. There was some Hessian sacks with the sail full of buoys and fishing net and a couple of masts. When we got it to the shore, it was, bearing in mind it was dark, it was the middle of the night, but there was a full moon, and Christophe stood at the edge of the shore looking out to sea, looking for a break in the waves. And after waiting for a few minutes, there was an obvious lull in the waves, and he shouted, "Pull!" We started hauling the boat into the water. We got it, the nose of it into the water, and we managed to pull it out, and then we began to jump into the water, and then we paddling as hard as we could, and that moment a wave came in and it swamped to the front of the boat. The boat began to fill up with water. We all jumped out of the boat and held onto the boat. There was a lot of noise. People are shouting, "Hold on, hold on." We're holding onto this boat as this wave swamps it. The boat's filling up with water, and then the wave begins to pull out to sea again, and there's this pull, and the boat is being pulled under and pulled out, and my feet are sliding into the sand beneath my feet, this coarse sand, and I'm holding onto this boat for all I can, and the pull is enormous. Christophe has a hollowed out gourd, and he's bailing out water from the boat, and meanwhile we're holding onto this boat until he's bailed out enough water that it was light enough to begin to try to pull it back out of the water to the shore so we can totally empty it of water. Every time a wave came in, it gave us some push back up, and we managed to haul it back up. It took us a long time to get the boat out of water. We emptied it and then waited for another lull in the waves, and then repeated the whole process. We got swamped again. This happened 3 times. It took us about an hour of exhausting work to launch the boat. Finally, we managed to get out. We jumped into the boat. We started paddling frantically as hard as we could. There was no talk for 2 minutes. We just paddled until we'd got about 50 metres out to sea, through the waves, into calmer waters beyond the sea. And then we paddled out further. Christophe raised a mast. He got out a sail from one of the sacks. It was Hessian sacks sewn together. He raised it up as a sail. We started paddling with the wind, and we paddled and were blown out to sea for probably the next hour. We probably ended up 5-6 kilometres out to sea. It was the middle of the night. It was quiet. It was eerily quiet. There were no lights, just the stars above us, and 8 guys in this boat. I'm freezing cold, I'm soaking wet, absolutely drenched to the skin, huddled up on a bench, exhausted from paddling, blisters on my hands. And Christophe and the guys got a large fishing net, probably 150 metres long, a big drag net, and they let it out to sea with little boys holding it up. And then we sat in silence. Some of the guys fell asleep on their benches. And for 2 hours or so it was quiet, cold. The moon had set by this point. It was absolutely pitch black. And in those couple of hours before dawn, I sat in this boat. I couldn't see very much. The dim lights of fires from the village had long since disappeared. We were far out to sea, and there was this eerie silence. I remember thinking, why do I always get myself into these places? There was something very unnerving to be out at sea, to be far from the shore in this tree trunk of a boat. These guys seemed very much at home. They were confident. They weren't particularly bothered by it, but I was way outside my comfort zone yet again. And as I sat there in the dark and in the quiet, it got me thinking. I was certainly thinking about scenes from the New Testament. I was thinking about the fishermen. I was thinking about Peter, James and John in their fishing boats, and with Jesus in the boat with them out in the storm, fishing through the night. All these stories were coming alive in my mind as I was sitting there on this uncomfortable bench trying to sleep, completely unable to sleep, sitting up, cold. But there was something fun and alive in this moment. And then as daybreak broke, the beautiful dawn in the east, and in the early light of the morning, we hauled in the net. I was full of anticipation and hope. The net was very heavy, so the weight of the net as we were pulling it in, I was convinced it was absolutely loaded with fish. I had this image of hauling in fish after fish after fish. We pulled in the whole net, and there were 6 small fish caught in the end of the net. I could not believe it. These poor guys all looked pretty disappointed. We hauled in the net, we got the fish out. They were sitting dead in the bottom of the boat. And we started heading for shore. It was a calm morning. There was no wind. There was no wind to blow us back into shore. So we just started paddling. We paddled for an hour, then 2 hours. The guys had an amazing rhythm as they're paddling. Sometimes they would be paddling double time, then they would slow it down, and then they would be singing and chanting, and tapping their paddles on the side of the boat, and dipping and paddling and dipping and tapping, and a great rhythm was going. It was great fun. It was hard work. And then when we could see the shore, we stopped. I was quite surprised by this. Christophe pulled out one of his sacks, and he got out from the bottom of the sack a whole bunch of sand, beach sand, and he spread a bed of sand in the bottom of this dugout canoe. And then he got another sack and he brought out some broken coconut shells, and he made a little fire in the boat out at sea, and we grilled these 6 small fish and shared them out between the 8 of us, and we had a breakfast there on the sea. We then paddled into shore, and finally, by about midday, after being out on the water for probably 10 hours, we got back to the beach. I was exhausted, ready to sleep, soaking wet, itchy from sand and salt, but it had been an experience. And this was one of those experiences that I learnt through. Even as I have been reflecting back on it and thinking, what did I learn through this experience? I realised that this was an Ebenezer moment. This was a moment where God helped me, because actually God was helping me understand myself. I realised that I am someone who learns through experiences. I'm learning this about myself, and I was learning this about myself then, that I need to go through things myself to learn. I need to touch and to feel and to smell and to handle. I do learn through reading, there's no doubt about that. I learn through books. I'm an intellectual learner in that sense, but I learn through experience. I'm an experiential, sensorial learner. And I realised that I'd grown up with learning very much as an academic pursuit, but I felt like God was helping me to see that actually I learn through experience, I learn through touch, and particularly I feel that God speaks to me through what I experience. I realised that these fishermen were very real people. This was their ordinary life. And I realised that Jesus spoke to the disciples in their ordinary, everyday life. They were real people. They were fishermen. That was how he came to them. He didn't come to them in an otherworldly way. He came to them where they were. And even as I was with these fishermen out at sea, in their comfort zone, in their place of expertise, I experienced his stories, Jesus' stories, in a fresh way. I could picture coming into this beach in the early morning, having fished all night and not caught a thing, and imagining Jesus there on the beach with a nice coal fire, preparing breakfast and shouting out to us on the boat, "Go back out, let your nets down again," and being exhausted and knowing you've paddled all night, you're exhausted, you're wet, you're discouraged, you're despondent, you're just ready to sleep. But because it's Jesus, you turn around and you let your fishing nets back out again. I experienced something that night that books couldn't have taught me. I experienced something firsthand. And I think through experiences like that, I resolved myself. This was how I wanted to learn. I wanted to be someone who volunteered. I wanted to be someone who jumped into new experiences so that I could grow through it. And I also resolved that this is how I wanted to teach. I wanted to be someone who would learn as I'm making a loaf of bread, as I'm planting in the garden, as I'm working with wood, as I'm knitting, as I'm doing things. And then I want to teach in that way. I don't want to just teach standing at the front talking. I don't just want to teach through a book. I want people to touch and to see. And I realised that's totally how Jesus taught. It was through experience. Through much of our trip, I realised I was looking for the miraculous. I was praying for big things. I was asking to see God move in big ways. I was looking for the extraordinary. And I realise now that the areas where I found God, the areas where God spoke to me, were actually in the very ordinary things of everyday mundane life. God is the God of the ordinary. It was extraordinary for me because it was new, it was novel, it was a new experience, but it was ordinary, everyday life, and that was where Jesus was speaking to me. I realise as well that I don't simply learn by experience. I learn by reflecting on experience. In fact, I may not learn by experience at all. I learn by reflecting on my experiences. I want to be someone who does, reflects on what they've done, and then is in a place to teach others about that. I realise that's how God loves to work in our lives. And so for me, this was an Ebenezer moment. This was a moment of, I suppose, self-realisation, of realising the kind of person I am, of realising how I love to hear from God, of realising the ways in which God is able to speak to me because of who I am. And I suspect that many other people are the same. And as we reflect on our experiences, especially our unique and our novel and our unusual experiences, as we reflect on those experiences, they become the truth through which God can speak to us.